Every once in a while, somebody asks me, what was it like to DJ in the 1980s? Well, it was very different than today. And it was more than just the gear. I know the gear is what a lot of people are interested in, what it was like with records and turntables and such. But there's more to the story, and to really give you an idea of what it was really like, I gotta talk about stuff other than the gear. But let's go ahead and talk about the gear first. Yeah, it was turntables and records for the most part. Cassettes are something that you used in a jam. Like, you had no choice. You could not source the song for one reason or another on a record, so you ended up with it on cassette. And they were a drag to cue. You couldn't manipulate the speed or anything for any meaningful mixing. But yeah, I mean, in a pinch, cassettes. And if you were really cool and you were working in either a club or a premium skating rink, starting in probably about, I would guess, 1983, music video on VHS tape. Yeah, and there were different places that you could get music video for a skating rink or for a nightclub. There were services that made video, kind of like today with Promo Only and Top Hits USA. The light shows were very cheesy. You had these halogen bulb wash effects that took a lot of power. I mean, 250, 500 watts a can sometimes. The mirror ball, the pin spots, those were a staple. But, you know, when you were setting up your equipment, you always tried to find two power outlets, because there was no way that you were going to reasonably run a passive sound system, amplifier, and speakers, plus a light show on one circuit. You were going to pop a breaker. So anytime we would load in for a mobile job, we would look for two outlets on a wall and make sure the light show was plugged into one and the sound system was plugged into the other. And you were limited on how big your light show could be because, well, you only had so much power to work with at most venues. You didn't want to pop the circuit, so you had to keep your light shows really good, but at a relative minimum compared to what you might see today. As far as mobile DJing went back then, I don't think I knew anybody who DJed alone. Everybody had an assistant, or there were two DJs at every event. And it wasn't because it took two DJs to actually DJ an event. It took two people to carry in all this heavy stuff. These amp racks, passive speakers, crates and crates of records that weighed a lot. So, yeah, I mean, the way we would do it is we would have somebody designated as the assistant, sometimes where they would find the songs that the DJ wanted and give them to him. They'd dig through the crates. They'd maybe work the light show. Other times, you had a designated MC and a designated DJ. You worked it out. But it was nice because you were able to always work with someone and learn from someone and bounce ideas off of each other. And I think it made for some pretty fun gigs back then. To really wrap your head around what it was like to DJ in the 1980s, you got to think about the climate at the time, what it was like. Remember, no internet. Oh yeah, there was some geek at school who had a computer that you did your homework on or whatever, maybe. And for some reason, they could use this thing called a modem to call another computer and do some kind of, I don't know, communication with them. So that technology did exist, computers and communicating with other computers via phone line, but it wasn't a normal thing. This was not something that you would do if you were into music necessarily. This is something you do if you were into science or computing, and only the geeks had it. So there was none of that. And the phone thing. I mean, no mobile phones, guys. So if you wanted to talk to somebody on the phone, you better hope they were home when you called their home phone. Somebody else would answer. You'd ask if that person was home, and they would go look for that person and give them the phone. If they weren't home, you don't get to talk to them. So socially, it was very different. People really had to plan their meetings and gatherings. It wasn't as easy as just texting somebody, hey, where are you? I'll meet you there. No, you had to make this plan. Hey, what do you want to do Friday? You want to go to the movies? You want to go skating? You want to go to the club? What do you want to do? You'd make that plan and you'd execute it and just hope that they were going to show up and they weren't going to flake on you. Music and fashion were two things that were constantly evolving, and I mean constantly. When you think about things like haircuts, we can have the same haircut in jeans and t-shirts now for 10 years, and people don't really say too much about it, but back then, you would look very dated because fashion was constantly moving forward. And people didn't look alike. People typically had very different hair and different clothes. Music was constantly evolving too. You couldn't talk about a song that came out 3 months ago. That was old news. You had to talk about the song that was out right now. There was always something happening, and there were new sounds in these songs because new technology was being created to produce music. Drum machines, synthesizers, the samplers went from 8-bit to 16-bit to 32-bit, and you could kind of tell how old a song was by what equipment they were using to produce the music that they were making. Like you can tell a song from 1982 versus a song from 1987. Very different vibe to those tracks. So, you could confuse one artist with the next. That was easy to do. You could do that today too, because they were doing sort of the same type of music, be it rock or metal or new wave or whatever. But the songs themselves, you wouldn't confuse one for the other. They all sounded pretty different. And the only exception to that might be hip hop. There was like some serious formulation with that where it sounded a certain way. And the look of hip hop was more the average Joe on the street in the neighborhood, right? Think about Run DMC and Beastie Boys and acts like that. They look like they did before they made it big. They were dressing the same and in many cases acting the same. But in all other music, people might as well have been from outer space, man. I mean, Prince, Michael Jackson, forget about it. We didn't look like the people who were in the music videos that we were watching, playing the music that we loved. And speaking of music and music videos, there are two kinds of scenes that I want to talk about. Now, before I go any further, I live in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and that's important to know because I'm telling you this from my perspective. But what I can tell you is that there was something that I would consider a national scene. And that's the music that everybody kind of got. And most people got this music from MTV. If you had cable, and you were lucky enough to have MTV, you were getting this constant barrage of music videos with new tracks. They were only trying to play the best of the best stuff. And that was kind of what everyone was listening to nationwide. If it was on MTV, you were hearing it. There were other shows, like Friday Night Videos. If you didn't have cable, maybe you watched Friday Night Videos. There was American Bandstand. There was Soul Train. But, music video was such a huge thing. It had been around for a long time. I mean, the Beatles were making stuff like this. I believe Buddy Holly and Bill Haley and the Comets were doing stuff like this way back in the 50s, but it became a real viable, I guess, medium to promote your music. And not only your music, but sometimes your films. Back then, soundtracks were a big deal. Today, when somebody makes a movie, they'll pick some songs, maybe from the past, and they'll use them in their movie soundtrack. It was different back then. They would make brand new music from major recording artists, hit songs, specifically for movie soundtracks. So they'd make a song for Footloose, they'd make a song for Top Gun, they'd make a song for Vision Quest, and all kinds of movies. Ferris Bueller's Day Off had some. Bright Lights Big City was a great soundtrack. There were several of them. And you could only get these certain songs that were popular on these movie soundtracks. And you'd watch MTV, you'd see the video for the song, and it would promote the film. That's how big music video was back then. Now, the other scene was the local scene. Now, that was different from the national scene, from MTV and all that other stuff. This is whatever was going on in your community. And a lot of this was local radio. There weren't the big national conglomerate radio stations like you have now, where wherever you go, there's like a Kiss FM, and every Kiss FM's kind of playing the same thing. Now, back then, it was all very regional. If you lived in the city, sometimes you got college radio. That was local stuff. Maybe you went out to clubs. You'd hear things at clubs that you weren't hearing on the radio. That was cool. I was young. It was skating rinks for me. And the skating rinks is where I discovered like electro and freestyle. That's where I'm hearing Debbie Deb and Trenier and Houdini and LA Dream Team for the first time. I wouldn't have heard it anywhere else. Wasn't on the radio, and it wasn't on MTV. That was very much a skating culture thing. So, Milwaukee, we had a local scene. We had some rock, we had Violent Femmes. If you go to Chicago, their local scene, there was a lot of house music. A lot of industrial stuff, too. What's odd about that is I'm 80 miles from Chicago, and I didn't get any of that. I mean, not until much later, because that was a very local scene. Those are the bands that were playing at the bars and the clubs, or the songs that local radio stations just decided to play. And it wasn't necessarily what everyone else was hearing everywhere else. Minneapolis had a scene with Prince and all that, and of course that became national, but they went deeper into it. Miami had the freestyle stuff. New York had all kinds of cool stuff going on with hip hop and new wave and rock and you name it. They had a variety of things happening all at the same time. LA had a scene. Seattle had a scene. All these different places had different music going on that the next state or city or whatever may not necessarily have been hearing. So Milwaukee, for example, of course I'm worried about the national scene because everyone's hearing kind of the same thing, but I'm not worried about what's going on in Chicago so much. I definitely need to worry about what's going on in my hometown though. So take all that and think about what it must have been like going out to a club or a skating rink or somewhere where there was a DJ back in the old days. DJs were the music programmers. That's what we did. And I think partygoers kind of understood that. They would go to a club or a skating rink or wherever, and they would just kind of dig on the vibe that was happening. You know, it wasn't about going there and trying to create the vibe. We have that now. Everybody's a music programmer because they all have Spotify, and they think they can program for everyone. If it makes them happy, it should make everybody else happy. Not the case. You learned that very early on as a DJ. I certainly did. I'm sure you did too. But that's the new conception of the general public. Everyone can program. They can't. That's another video. Back then, they would just come in and check out the scene, and that was really cool. So the requests were different. They wouldn't come up always and ask for specific songs. It did happen, but most of the time it was about, hey, can you put a slow track on? Or, do you have any rock? Or, do you have any R&B kind of thing? And you didn't have every song with you. You couldn't reasonably have every song with you because records were heavy. You brought the best of the best of the best with you in your crates when you DJ'd. You didn't bring any fluff. I know I used to go through my crates quite a bit. If there were tracks that I just never touched, I was happy to get rid of them because there was something else that I was dying to get in that crate that I could have used at the last few gigs that I did. Now, to get all this music that was in these crates, we spent a lot of time in record shops. We have to go there, physically go there, in the car, and thumb through records and shop for things and have a list of songs that you're looking for that you need for your next gig, or just stuff you want or stuff that you think is going to work well. And you're real selective about what you grab because you only have so much money to spend and you only have so much allocated space to drag the stuff along with you. You don't want to buy anything that's going to be a dud. Did I do it? Yeah, absolutely. You take a chance sometimes. Sometimes there's a song that you think is going to be great and the audience that you're playing for isn't feeling that track. It happens. Other times you skip a track because you don't like it and it turns out that's the track you really needed to have. One example I can give you of that would be B-52's Love Shack. There's no way in my brain that anybody was going to want to hear that song, and it turned out to be really hot. But I dismissed it. I thought it was crap and no one was going to want to hear it. We do our best. We make mistakes. We learn along the way. Sometimes you pick up the 12-inch single. Sometimes you get the 45. And, some people might say, well, why are you DJing with 45s? Well, some of the gigs that I was doing, they didn't want to hear the extended version, which might have been the only version available on the 12-inch. They wanted the familiar radio edit of the song. And sometimes that was only on the 45. Yes, CDs did exist in the 1980s. But it was relatively new technology. I don't think it was released to the general public until like 84 or something like that. I didn't have my first CD player until 1987. And, one thing about CDs that's important to remember is the players were not always the most roadworthy things in the world. You had to treat them with kid gloves or you could mess them up. And CDs were very expensive. Sometimes you might want one track and you'd have to buy an entire CD to get one song. And the CDs were not cheap. They were like $16, $20 sometimes. It's outrageous. And even if money wasn't an issue, even if it didn't matter how much this stuff costs, not everything was available on CD. They hadn't done a lot of back catalog stuff yet. Some artists were not releasing things on CD. Remember, we couldn't record on these things back then. You just had to buy it. There was no recording anything. There was no downloading anything. If you wanted a song, you had to go out and seek it out and buy it. And the best way to do that is on a record. As far as the 80s go, I really think of it as more of an era than a decade. And for me, it goes up to about 1992. That's when Nirvana came out and NWA and kind of changed everything. 90, 91, and 92 were definitely extensions of the 1980s in spirit anyway. And how does that all compare to today? Well, the gear is much easier, obviously. We don't have to worry about sucking too much power from the wall because everything's pretty efficient with LED lights and D-class amplifiers. We're not carrying around crates of music anymore. We have it on our laptop computers. We don't have to go out to the store to find that one track that they got to hear because we can download it. There's a lot of cool stuff that's made this job a lot easier. We don't have to bring an assistant with us. We can do this ourselves. I can do it myself one-handed. The one thing I can say that I do miss, though, is when people would just come into the scene to check out the scene and not really try to come in and become the programmer. The programmer, like I said, should be the DJ's job, not Karen who walks in and thinks she knows better than everybody else because she's got a cool Spotify list. So yeah, for the most part, it's easier today. It's fun today. I'll take the good with the bad. And I will take all of the experience that I gained back in those days and use it today. And I think it makes me a better DJ for being back there and doing what I did. But anyway, that's it. Hope I did okay with this video. Hope it makes sense. Hope you enjoy it. That's it. We'll see you next time. I appreciate you so much. Practice and enjoy.